For 2 decades, 10 men sat behind rusted bars, forgotten, condemned, and erased from the national memory. Their families buried them alive with each passing year. But when President Ibrahim Traoré stepped inside Koudigou Central Prison, something shifted. One man, barely able to stand, looked him in the eye and whispered, "They said you'd never come." What he revealed next forced the president to stop breathing and rewrote the destiny of a nation. But here's the question that haunts every scene. What happens when a leader listens, really listens to the voices buried by power? The walls of Koudigou prison didn't just hold men. They held time. Rust crept over iron gates like a slow disease, and the sun, when it reached through the narrow windows, only exposed more dust. Deep in the southern cell block, 10 men existed in the shadows of a forgotten file. No nameplate, no public record, just numbers etched above their bunks, numbers that replaced the lives they once had. Salam hadn't spoken in days, his voice lost to years of screaming into rooms where no one listened. Isaka still scratched lesson plans into his mattress with a toothpick, dreaming of the classroom they tore him from. Boubacar's right hand trembled from the beatings, but his eyes, sharp and awake, watched everything. The 3 brothers from Toma sat shoulder to shoulder in silence, one of them humming a folk song only their mother would remember. Armel had become their translator inside, turning emotion into words for those too broken to speak. Madu, the former soldier, stared at the ceiling, as if it still carried the secrets of a war he tried to stop. They were innocent men in a system designed to forget them. No lawyer returned their letters, no family dared challenge the court that vanished them. The guards no longer asked why they were there, only when they'd die. On the wall behind their cell, someone had scratched in charcoal, "Lee Tublier, the country has forgotten you." And yet one morning, without warning, a whisper passed through the yard. Like wind over dry grass, a man in green is coming. But not just any man. The one who still believes truth can dig through concrete. No one dared to hope, but no one slept that night. The letter was creased 100 ways, its corners smudged with sweat, earth, and time. No official stamp, no envelope, just trembling handwriting on repurposed paper, torn from a prison inventory log. It passed through many hands, hidden in shoe soles, buried inside a bag of dry rice, slipped beneath the tray of a sympathetic kitchen boy. But it was the night guard, Sergeant Uriogo, who finally carried it past the steel gates. He didn't read it. He didn't need to. The eyes of the man who gave it to him, Soleil May, said more than ink ever could. "If this reaches the right eyes," Soleil May had whispered, "maybe someone will remember we're still alive." Weeks later, it surfaced inside a plain folder on President Ibrahim Traoré's desk, sandwiched between defense updates and foreign correspondence. The letter nearly went unnoticed, but Traoré paused when he saw the makeshift parchment. He held it like a fragile relic, his thumb resting on the crude handwriting. "We were buried, not sentenced. 10 of us, Koudigou, please, before one more of us dies. Come see." He read it twice, then a third time. He said nothing to his ministers, but something shifted. That evening, during a closed-door meeting, Minister Zongo pushed a file across the table. "Sir, you're needed in Kaya next week for infrastructure talks." Traoré didn't even glance at it. "No," he said, "we're going to Koudigou." Zongo frowned. "There's nothing there but old ruins and a prison." The president looked up. "Exactly." And just like that, the machinery of silence trembled because one forgotten letter had finally reached the only man in power who still believed that justice starts with listening. The convoy never came. No sirens, no flashing flags, no line of black SUVs parting traffic like a royal tide. Just one military green pickup truck, its tires coated in red dust, rolling quietly through the outer gates of Koudigou prison at dawn. President Ibrahim Traoré wore no insignia, just a faded uniform sleeves rolled to the forearms and a scarf around his neck like any other field officer. He stepped out without a word, nodded once to the stunned gatekeeper, and entered. No cameras, no national press, only the prison warden, speechless and pale, trying to process what history had just walked into his office. "I want to see the ones the state forgot," Traoré said. "But Excellency, I wasn't told," the warden stammered. "You weren't meant to be." They led him past cell blocks that hadn't been painted in over a decade. Inmates stared, murmurs, rippled words spread faster than footsteps. The president was here, the man from the stories, the man who once said no one in Burkina Faso should be left behind, even in chains. And then the southern wing. When the door opened, silence fell like a curtain. 10 men rose slowly, some squinted, unsure if their minds were playing tricks on them. Salam stepped forward, trembling. "You're him." "I'm the man who received your letter," Traoré said softly. Armel blinked back tears. "We thought you were a ghost, or hope was." Traoré walked the row, shook each hand, no speeches, just names, stories, wounds reopened. The guards turned their eyes away, not out of shame, but because they couldn't bear the weight of what was happening. For 20 years, these men were erased, but now truth had come not in thunder, but in footsteps. Salam sat across from President Traoré on a wooden stool that creaked with every shift of his tired frame. His hands, once calloused from building homes in Bobo Dioulasso, now trembled with the weight of time. He didn't begin with, "Your Excellency." He began with silence, long, heavy silence. Then finally he said, "I was a mason, I built the house he sleeps in." Traoré didn't interrupt. Salam took a deep breath. "The minister, Benno Nabaloum, he took money meant for housing widows. I found the documents. I warned him I'd tell." A week later, a man was shot dead outside a market. They said it was me. They said they had prints. He held out his hands like a man offering proof. But I'd never even seen that gun. Traoré's jaw clenched. The investigator was his cousin, and the judge owed him favors. They locked me up before I even saw a lawyer. "What about appeals?" the president asked. Salam laughed, but there was no joy in it. "I filed them. They vanished like I did." Traoré looked at the guard in the corner. "Bring me the case file, everything." The guard hesitated. "That's an order," Traoré said. Salam lowered his gaze. "They said you'd never come, that men like me rot and men like him rise." "But you're still here," Traoré replied, "and so is the truth." For a moment, Salam looked younger, not because the years had been erased, but because someone finally had seen him, not as a prisoner, but as a man. Outside, the sun broke through the clouds, but inside, for the first time in 20 years, a light came from within. It wasn't justice yet, but it was the beginning. Isaka Diallo had once been the pride of Zinyaré, a literature teacher who wore pressed shirts, carried chalk in his pocket, and quoted Sankara with reverence. His students called him the Professor Dupulo, the people's professor. But during the twilight years of the Compaoré regime, it only took one sentence to destroy him. "I said," Isaka whispered, his voice cracking, "that truth belongs to no regime, that one day even a lion must answer to the forest." He looked up at President Traoré, who stood motionless. "They twisted it," Isaka continued. "The regional commander's son was in my class next morning. I was arrested for inciting rebellion. They said I was calling for an uprising." He laughed, bitter and hollow. "I was grading essays when they kicked in my door." The courtroom, he explained, had been a formality, no defense, no witnesses, just a statement read aloud from a paper he was never allowed to see. He was sentenced to life not for what he did, but for the fear his words awakened. "And the children?" Traoré asked. "Scattered," Isaka said, eyes moist. "Some stopped going to school, some left the country. One wrote me, once called me brave. I wept for days." The president took a slow breath. "You were never a threat, Isaka. You were a mirror, and they couldn't stand the reflection." Isaka smiled weakly. That's the first time someone called me by name in years. The prison guard shifted, uncomfortable. President Traoré stood. We'll find that trial transcript and we'll burn the lies with it. Isaka straightened his back. For the first time in 2 decades, he had spoken truth once and paid the price. But now finally truth had returned, wearing a uniform and carrying justice on its shoulders. Boubacar didn't speak right away. He stared at his hands, and the fingers curled unnaturally, remnants of a fractured wrist that never healed right. When he finally looked up at President Traoré, his voice came slow, like someone unearthing a memory they'd tried to forget. I was a mechanic in Tenedo. I fixed engines, didn't ask questions, just kept my head down. He paused. One day a white Hilux disappeared from the mayor's lot, and they said I had keys, said I drove it out of town, and they showed witnesses I'd never seen. Traoré narrowed his eyes. And the truck, they found it 3 weeks later in a government convoy heading north. Boubacar's lips twisted. Same plate, same dent on the back panel, but no apology, no correction, just silence. The president's hands clenched into fists behind his back. They broke me in interrogation, Boubacar said. If I confessed they'd go easy, I was 19. I signed the paper, thought I'd be out in a year that was 17 years ago, and no one followed up, no appeal. Traoré asked. My mother died thinking I was guilty, Boubacar said quietly. She never looked me in the eye again. Traoré looked toward the barred window. What happened to the official who signed the arrest order? Promoted to regional director, got a medal too. Traoré nodded once, then turned to the attending officer. I want the registry of that convoy, every name, every destination. The officer hesitated, then moved. Boubacar exhaled for what felt like the first time in years. They said nobody would care about a mechanic, he murmured. The president knelt beside him. They were wrong. And in that moment, Boubacar didn't feel like a prisoner, he felt like a citizen, and someone finally was fixing the engine of justice. They stood together, as they always had, Yahya with shoulders like carved stone, Adama with a farmer's calm eyes, and Salif the youngest, who hadn't yet turned 30 when they were taken. The scars on their wrists were faded, but the anger in their voices had not dulled. President Traoré stood before them, arms crossed, saying nothing as Yahya spoke first. We are sons of Toma, that land fed our father and his father before him. We planted millet, raised goats, built wells with our bare hands, and then one day men in suits arrived, foreigners backed by our own prefect. They pointed at the ground and called it gold. Adama picked up where his brother left off. We said no. We refused to sell that night. Our granary burned 2 weeks later. Soldiers came with papers accusing us of attacking state workers and damaging equipment we never touched. Salif, quieter than the others, spoke last. They said our resistance made us enemies of progress. But progress never looked like bulldozers tearing through graves. Their trial was swift, held in a town they didn't belong to, in a language their mother didn't understand. The lawyer assigned to them never showed they were sentenced for sabotage and obstruction of state interest. Traoré's voice was low, and the mine, shut down 5 years ago. Yahya replied, left behind poison in the river and children who coughed blood. The president's jaw tightened. Who signed off on the license? A man who now owns 3 houses in Abidjan. Adama said, but no one dares speak his name. Traoré looked them in the eyes. I will. And for the first time in years, the brothers didn't feel like rebels. They felt like protectors of land, of truth, of something sacred that was nearly lost. Armel's voice was soft, refined, every syllable shaped with care, as if language itself had become sacred during his years in confinement. He sat on the edge of his bunk knees, crossed posture unnaturally elegant for a man who hadn't seen open skies in nearly 15 years. I was only the bridge, he said. The words were not mine, but I knew their weight. President Traoré nodded for him to continue. The year was 2010. A French journalist had arrived in Ouagadougou to investigate reports of forced displacement and beatings in the eastern region, where land was being seized for a state-sponsored mining deal. Armel, a university-trained translator, was hired to interpret interviews between the journalists and victims. He translated every tear, every bruise, every buried name. The article that followed made international headlines. 2 days later, Armel was arrested at dawn. They accused me of espionage. He said I fed lies to destabilize the country. I was held for 36 hours before anyone even told me why. The journalist expelled the victims threatened, and Armel, the quiet voice who gave them language, was erased. "Why didn't you fight it?" Traoré asked. "I tried," Armel said. "But in court, my job was turned into a weapon. They called me a foreign agent, a traitor to my own people." Traoré paced slowly. "You gave truth a voice." Armel looked up. "I thought I had betrayed my country until you walked in today." "No," the president said, pausing. "Your country betrayed you." In that cell, justice didn't roar. It whispered through the words of a translator who never picked a side, only told the truth. And now that truth had finally reached the one man who could no longer ignore it. Madou sat upright, his spine still disciplined by years in uniform. His hair had thinned, and his left eye carried a scar from an accident in custody, but his voice was clear, steady, like the crack of a command. President Traoré stood across from him, silent, listening. "I was a logistics officer in the 22nd Battalion," Madou began. "We were tracking munitions for northern deployments on paper. Everything matched. In reality, crates were missing, not a few dozens, repeatedly." He took a breath and then dropped the name General Kodio. His signature was on the proofed manifests. The weapons didn't go north, and they went east into pickup trucks we were told not to follow. I sent in a report 1 week later. I was reassigned to barracks duty, then accused of subversive behavior and detained for compromising national security. Traoré's jaw tightened. Kodio had once served in the Transitional Government's Advisory Wing, a decorated hero, a name carved into ceremonies. "You saw them being loaded?" the president asked. "With my own eyes," Madou said. "Rocket launchers, grenades, ammo, all headed to ghost locations. Then 6 months later, those same weapons showed up in ambush sites. We lost dozens of our men to our own stockpile." He leaned forward. "Sir, I didn't betray my uniform. I tried to save it." Traoré's hands clenched behind his back. "Who else knew?" "A few officers. They vanished. One died in a road accident. Another deserted. Only I made it here." The silence stretched. Then Traoré turned to the attending officer. "Bring me everything with Kodio's name, every shipment, every seal from day one." "Yes, Mr. President." Madou didn't smile. Soldiers don't celebrate before the war is over, but for the first time in 20 years, the battlefield was shifting in his favor. The cell block was quiet, not from fear, but reverence. President Ibrahim Traoré had sat with each man one by one, hour after hour, in the heat of that crumbling prison where justice had once gone to die. He asked no scripted questions. He brought no notepad. Only his eyes listened, and his silence spoke volumes. They had all shared their stories: Salam's betrayal, Isaka's misquoted defiance, Boubacar's stolen youth, the 3 brothers, and their poisoned land, Armel's punished translation, Madou's buried truth. None begged, none cried, and they didn't need to. The truth had already carved deep lines into their faces. Each word they spoke peeled back the rot that had festered for decades beneath polished courtrooms and hollow state honors. Traoré said little in return. But with each story, something shifted in him. His posture stiffened, his gaze darkened, his breathing slowed, like a soldier studying a battlefield before the first shot. A guard approached, nervous. "Sir, Shall we return to the capital? Traoré didn't answer right away. He was looking at the wall where someone had once scratched a simple phrase in charcoal, Lee Toublier. I want that wall preserved, he said finally, exactly as it is. He turned back to the 10 men. You will not be forgotten, not again. In his silence, promises had formed unspoken, yet indestructible. He didn't raise his voice, didn't point fingers, didn't promise a parade. But those watching him closely, his aides, the prison staff, the trembling officer in the corner, they saw it. A storm was brewing behind his calm. Not a storm of vengeance, but of reckoning, the kind that begins not in headlines, but in quiet rooms where truth is finally given permission to speak and power for once chooses to listen. Back at Kosam Palace, the air was stiff with unease. The marble floors gleamed, the gold-framed portraits hung undisturbed, but inside the Situation Room, nothing felt stable. President Ibrahim Traoré stood at the head of the table, silent, arms, folded eyes burning through the folders piled before him. Prison records, tribunal notes, and sealed reports no one had dared to open for years. Across from him sat his closest advisors, Minister of Justice Cabre, Internal Affairs Chief Sankara, and Security Director Zongo. All three exchanged glances before Cabre cleared his throat. Mr. President, he began carefully, we understand the emotion truly, but these cases are from another time. We inherited a fragile peace. Do we really want to open wounds we've managed to keep closed? Buried, Traoré corrected, not closed. Sankara leaned forward, voice low. Sir, some of the names involved, they still hold power. Foreign partners, military allies. This isn't justice, it's political suicide. Zongo added, the system survived by forgetting digging into this could unravel the very fabric we're trying to stabilize. Traoré looked at them one by one. So, we protect the fabric even if it was stitched with lies. No one answered. He placed a document on the table, Madu's transfer order stamped by General Kodio. I will not lead a government that calls truth a threat. Cabre exhaled. At least proceed quietly, no press, no grand statements. I didn't go there for a statement. Traoré said, I went for answers. He turned to leave, but paused at the door. You want to save the system, I want to save the soul of this nation. The door shut behind him. Inside, the cabinet sat in silence, not because they agreed, but because deep down they knew a storm was coming. And this time, it had a conscience. The basement of the Ministry of Justice smelled of damp paper and forgotten sins. Dim bulbs flickered over rusted filing cabinets, each drawer swollen with dust-coated folders. President Traoré stood in the narrow corridor, sleeves rolled tight, discarded, as if preparing for excavation, not governance. He didn't send aides. He came himself. Start here, he told the archivist, pointing to the decades spanning 2005 to 2015. I want every file linked to Koudagou tribunal records, arrest warrants, judgment notes, everything. The archivist hesitated. Sir, some documents were misfiled. Find them. Hours turned to days, stacks grew. One by one, the files revealed a system held together by shadows and signatures, arrest warrants without witnesses, trial transcripts missing entire pages, confessions signed with fingerprints of the wrong-hand judges who heard cases after midnight, prosecutors promoted days after verdicts. Traoré flipped open Solemn's file. The fingerprint analysis was a photocopy, blurry, unsigned, unverifiable. Isaka's judgment cited sedition, but didn't quote his words, just a vague accusation. He implied disloyalty to the state. Boubacar's conviction referenced a stolen vehicle. The same license plate was recorded as part of a state convoy 6 weeks later. Traoré said nothing. He kept reading. He found a memo yellowed and water-stained. It was a directive stamped confidential, ordering the immediate surveillance and preemptive detention of disruptive individuals. 10 names followed, all familiar: Yahya Adama, Salif, Armel Madou, and at the bottom, action to be taken discreetly, public trials discouraged. He stood slowly, the folder trembling in his grip. This wasn't justice, he murmured. It was strategy. Upstairs the city buzzed on, unaware. But in the underbelly of government, President Ibrahim Traoré had unearthed something foul, not law, not order, just rot, and the smell of something long dead, finally being dragged into the light. The television studio was quiet, sterile, lit for clarity, but heavy with tension. Judge Lambert Combo sat under the harsh lights, his black robe replaced by a modest gray suit, hands folded tightly in his lap. For 20 years, he had vanished from public life. Retired, they said, faded, but now summoned by the weight of history. And the president's personal request, he had returned to say the one thing the nation wasn't ready for: the truth. "I was a judge in Wahiguya Regional Court," he began, voice brittle. "I signed 3 convictions tied to the Koudougou cases. I knew the files were wrong, the evidence was broken, but the orders were clear." The interviewer shifted, uneasy. "Orders from whom?" Combo paused. "Ministry of Interior and others I was told not to name. I was warned: convict or disappear." He reached into his coat pocket and unfolded a faded sheet of paper. "This is the directive I received in 2009. It doesn't list the accused by name, just numbers. The sentence lengths were pre-written." He looked directly into the camera. "I sentenced men I believed were innocent because I wanted to live. I told myself I was preserving order, but all I did was become another weapon in the hands of cowards." The nation watched in stunned silence. In market shops, classrooms, the country froze. Traoré, watching from the presidential office, didn't blink. The interviewer's voice cracked. "Why confess now?" "Because the man who visited that prison still believes in a future, and the least I can do is clear the path behind him." When the broadcast ended, there was no applause, just the sound of a broken country beginning to hear itself speak, and the first stone of silence had finally shattered. The story broke on a Tuesday, beneath the dry heat of midday. It wasn't loud. It was surgical, a single headline on the front page of L'Événement: "Burkina Faso's ghost prisoners, the men time tried to bury." By nightfall, BBC picked it up, then Al Jazeera, then the New York Times. The journalist Sophia Moretti had received the files from an anonymous source, a leak traced back to someone inside the Ministry of Justice. Within hours, the names of the 10 prisoners, their photos, and their fabricated cases were plastered across international platforms: Salem's forged fingerprints, Isaka's trial without witnesses, Madou's report about missing weapons, now cross-verified with arms tracing logs. Sophia's report included scanned documents, audio clips from court clerks, even handwritten memos with state logos blacked out but still recognizable. One photo of the scrawled message, "Lupita oubliée," on the prison wall, circulated faster than any quote. Inside the presidential office, Traoré stood by the window as aides rushed in with reactions from embassies and NGOs. Human Rights Watch issued a statement. Amnesty demanded immediate action, and the African Union called for an inquiry. Minister Zongo muttered, "We've lost control of the narrative." "No," Traoré replied, eyes on the horizon. "We never owned it, we just silenced it." For the 10 men in Koudougou, it was the first time in years their names echoed beyond the prison walls. And for Burkina Faso, the world was no longer watching its president. The world was watching its conscience. The footage wasn't part of any official broadcast. It came from a handheld phone camera, shaky and unpolished, filmed outside a modest home in Koudougou. The man in the frame wore a faded security uniform, though he'd long retired. His name was Officer Hamid Traoré, and for 2 decades he had carried a secret heavier than his badge. "They begged us not to forget them," he said, eyes glossy, voice trembling. Every night before lockdown, one of them, usually the young one Salif, would ask, "Will anyone remember us tomorrow?" Nakr. He paused, reaching into his pocket for a crumpled piece of paper. This is a drawing Isaka gave me in 2011. He used soap and ash to sketch it on toilet paper. "It's of a classroom," he said. "If I ever disappear, show someone this, let them know I was a teacher once." Hamid broke down. "I didn't say anything, I didn't fight it. I just followed orders. We were told they were dangerous enemies of the state. But they were just men, some barely older than my own sons." He looked straight into the lens. "I didn't know how to fix it back then, but maybe by speaking now, maybe someone else will." The clip went viral. In Ouagadougou, protesters lit candles outside the courthouse. In Kaya, teachers marched with signs that read, "Nunja, we will never forget." Inside the prison, Armel watched the video on a small tablet given to him by a visiting rights group. He didn't speak for a long time, then he simply whispered, he remembered. For the first time, their pain was no longer just a sentence. It was a story, one the world had begun to tell. The hall chosen for the special tribunal was once used for military ceremonies. Tall ceilings, scarred floors, and a podium that had echoed with commands, but this time, it was the people who commanded attention. The room was packed: lawyers, journalists, victims' families, foreign observers, and at the center, the 10 men who had once vanished without a trace. President Traoré did not preside, but he sat in the front row, silent, his expression carved from stone. The first to testify was Madu. He stood tall, his uniform jacket worn but buttoned, and named the general who rerouted arms to terrorist hands. He brought logs, names, even photos. The room held its breath. Then Isaka took the stand. He recited the exact words from the lesson that condemned him, the same quote twisted into sedition. His former student stood from the crowd in tears, confirming the truth. Applause broke protocol. Salam told how a minister's stolen funds became a death sentence he never earned. The courtroom shifted from stunned silence to shaking heads. His forged fingerprint evidence was held aloft, now publicly discredited by forensic experts. One by one, they spoke with dignity, without rage. Their testimonies didn't scream, they cut. Then came Judge Combo, face pale, voice shaking. He admitted what the world now knew. "I was told to convict before I even heard the cases." A hush fell like fog. At day's end, the tribunal declared all 10 men wrongfully convicted. Their names would be expunged, their families compensated, and the architects of their injustice would face criminal review. But justice wasn't the loudest thing in that room. It was the sound of breath returning, of shame, being named, of a nation standing still, not in fear, but in awe. Redemption had a voice now, and it was deafening. The national address was brief, unpolished, and unlike any speech Burkina Faso had heard before. President Ibrahim Traoré stood on the steps of the Kosam Palace. No teleprompter, no polished rhetoric, just a man who had seen too much to pretend anymore. In front of him, the 10 men stood side by side. Some held framed documents, certificates of exoneration, others simply held each other. The crowd beyond the gates spilled into the streets, silent, watching. "These men," Traoré began, his voice clear, "are not just innocent." He looked at them one by one. "They are living proof that silence can be a sentence, that bureaucracy can become a weapon, and that justice, when abandoned, leaves wounds that echo for generations." He paused. "For 20 years we failed them. Not just the government, not just the courts, all of us, we let forgetting become policy." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some wept, some nodded. "But today," he said, "we stop pretending they never existed today. We call them by name." He turned slightly toward the men behind him. "Salam Isaka Boubacar, Yahya Adama Salif Armel Madu." His voice cracked, but he continued, "And all the others whose voices were stolen, you are not only free, You are the reason we must never stop listening." The applause wasn't thunderous. It was soft, slow, the kind of sound that comes when people are still processing pain and hope at the same time. Somewhere in the distance, church bells rang. And not for celebration, for memory. Justice had been declared, but it wasn't just about 10 men walking free. It was about a country learning to open its ears again before it forgot someone else. And in that moment, the Republic exhaled. The sky over Koutigu was still bruised with the last shades of night when the gates groaned open. Not with ceremony, no trumpets, no fanfare, but with the solemn dignity of something sacred being returned. The 10 men stood just inside the threshold. Their clothes clean, their backs straighter than the guards remembered. They didn't rush, they didn't cheer. They simply walked side by side into the waiting dawn. Inside the prison yard, hundreds of inmates pressed against the bars, watching in complete silence. Some clutched the iron with both hands, some bowed their heads, one whispered a prayer, another just whispered, "Go." As Salam stepped past the gate, he paused and looked back just once. His eyes scanned the rusted walls, the graffiti, the window, where light barely ever came through. He placed a hand on the cold stone and then let it go. Outside, a small crowd had gathered, not officials, not press, just villagers, family members, strangers who had followed the story like scripture. Some clapped, some wept. One woman knelt, hands lifted skyward. Isaka turned to Armel and said quietly, "We were buried alive." Armel replied, "Then this must be resurrection." At the front of the crowd stood President Ibrahim Traoré, alone, no entourage. He didn't speak. He simply nodded, and the 10 men nodded back. The road ahead was unknown, scarred, uncertain, but it was a road, and they were walking it as free men with the sun rising behind them, and history finally giving way to truth. In the silence that followed, one thing became clear to all who watched. This wasn't just a release. It was a reckoning. And it had arrived not with violence, but with footsteps in the morning light. The journey home was not the ending they had dreamed of. For some, the road led to villages that barely remembered their names. For others, there was no one waiting, just silence, and the ache of what time had stolen. Salam returned to a courtyard overrun with weeds. His mother's bench was still there, but she was not. Neighbors whispered apologies, unsure how to face a man who had once been declared dead by mistake. Boubacar arrived at his family's mechanics shop only to find it sold and renamed. A distant cousin stood behind the counter, unsure whether to embrace him or run. Yahya, Adama, and Salif knelt beside 3 grave markers under a mango tree. Their father, their sister, their uncle, all gone during their imprisonment. They poured libation, not just for grief, but to prove they were still standing. Madhu visited the barracks where he once trained recruits. The building was still there, the honor wasn't. But Isaka, he walked into the old school in Zinyare. It hadn't changed much. The chalkboard still bore half-erased lessons, desks were chipped. The principal, an old student now grown and graying, met him at the door with tears. "I kept your room," he whispered. "Hoped you'd come back one day." Isaka entered the classroom and picked up a piece of chalk. His hand trembled, then steadied. On the board he wrote, "Truth endures." Outside, children gathered at the window, curious. None of them knew who he was yet, but they would, because he had returned not just to remember, but to teach again. The homecomings were not perfect, but they were real, and that after 20 years was more than enough. The garden behind Kosam Palace was quiet, fragrant with hibiscus and the slow rustle of baobab leaves. President Ibrahim Traoré sat alone beneath a tree of national unity, planted decades ago to mark a promise the country had long failed to keep. His uniform jacket lay folded beside him, sleeves rolled, hands stained with soil. He had come here to think, not perform. Birds chirped in the branches, but they were not enough to drown the weight of the silence. They were innocent for 20 years, he said softly, almost to himself. But we were guilty for 21. He ran a hand over the trunk, tracing the old etchings left by children ministers and presidents, long gone, names faded, promises broken. But this tree still stood. An aide approached, hesitant. "Mr. President, the justice reforms. Shall we begin drafting?" Traoré didn't look up. "Not yet," he replied. "First we must listen not to lawyers, not to speeches, to the silence between the screams." The aide didn't understand, not fully, but he nodded and stepped away. From beneath the branches, Traoré could still see the prison walls in his mind, the trembling hands, the broken voices, the final words of Armel echoing from that cold cell. We were not enemies. We were just unheard. In a world rushing toward progress, something else now lingered behind him. A stillness, an ache, a question. What happens when a nation chooses to remember the people it tried so hard to forget? He stood slowly, brushed the soil from his palms, and looked up at the tree. No applause, no anthem, just a man, a memory, and the roots of justice beginning finally to take hold. And in the breeze, the past whispered back, "Never again." If this story moved, you don't just scroll past. Like this video to honor the 10 forgotten voices, comment your thoughts. Every voice matters. Subscribe to hear the stories others tried to bury. Share this video so the world never forgets what justice truly means, because when one man listens, a nation begins to heal.